I'm Dr. Jim Calvert. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and teaching professor. And today we're going to talk a little bit about how to study for college. One of the questions that I'm getting more and more over the years is when students are coming into college is asking me, how do I study for your classes? And I think there's a lot of, lack of training that happens for a lot of people in high school these days. And so they get to college and aren't really sure what to do or how to study for the classes. Now, there's no one easy way of studying, and there are lots of different kinds of classes. So I'm going to kind of focus on the primary way that most teachers teach, which is through lecture of some sort. And we'll talk a little bit about how to study that way. But there's a couple of other important issues to talk about up front that a lot of people are not even aware of that they need to do or need to think about before going into a classroom, about what is going to be required of them, what are college classes like, how many hours do you need to spend, and why do you need to spend those hours? So let's start off with one of the things that most people are not aware of is that on a 3 hour class, so you're getting 3 credit hours. And so let's assume it's a Monday, Wednesday, and Friday class. So you would be going for 50 minutes for each one of those days, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So you think, okay, that's a 3 hour class. You're going to have 42 hours of classes. Okay, so 42 hour, uh, literally 42 sessions of classes, and then a final exam. So that equals out to 45 hours that you're supposed to have in a class. That's in the classroom. Now remember, for accreditation standards, and all universities get accredited, and for accreditation standards, it's not just that time that you're in class, it's actually for time outside of the class. And in fact, the standards indicate that you should spend 2 hours outside of class for every hour that you're in class. So if you think about it that way, that means every week you're in class for 3 hours for a 3 hour class, 3 credit hour class. And again, I'm talking semester classes. If you're in a system, then that's a little bit different than a semester system. Well, then that means you're going to be spending 6 hours outside of class doing some sort of work. And a lot of people don't realize that, meaning that for you get 45 hours in the classroom, 42 class periods plus a final exam. And then you're supposed to spend twice that amount of time outside. You're going to be spending 90 hours outside of the class. So that's a lot of time. So your average week should be spent at a minimum of 3 hours in a class for a 3 hour class, and then another 2 hours per hour. So that's 6 hours that week outside of class studying for that class. Now, you and I know that there are some classes where you don't have to spend any time outside of class that doesn't require any time. And that you also know that there are some classes where 2 hours per class isn't enough. It's too detailed. There's too much information. But that's the general rule of thumb that you need to be thinking about pretty consistently, because that's the standards that are set forth for how much credit is offered. So it's not just simply the time that you're in class, because I've heard a lot of students tell me, well, you know, I'm in class 3 hours a week. Why do I have to do a whole lot more? That seems that shouldn't everything be given to me in that 3 hours? And if it can't be given to me in that 3 hours, why is it important to know? Well, there's no way you can give everything within 3 hours, right? 3 hours is to touch on topics, it's to explain topics, it's to give you more depth of knowledge, maybe give you some examples. But a lot of the learning has to come outside of class. Now, remember that 2 hours per class can be a lot of different things. It can be reading the textbook. It can be doing some sort of homework that is given to you. It can be a project-driven exercise. It can be anything that's outside that is taking you that amount of time, but classes need to be devised such that they have that amount of work outside of the classroom. Okay, so think about that first. If you think that way first, that'll help all of your other studying go more smoothly, because you're going to be going, I'm supposed to be spending that amount of time outside of the classroom. And again, I don't think most people know that. And in fact, I've talked to a lot of parents who had no idea that that was what their children should be doing when they get to college. And of course, The thing is, when you get to college, that's another factor. It shouldn't rely on your parents anyway, right? It should only be what you decide to do. Because, and that's one of the big transition problems that I found a lot is that throughout school, up through high school, oftentimes it's been the parents who've kind of given you that extra push to make sure that you did the work. And then when you get to college, there's nobody else there but you to make sure that you set aside that time. So keep that in mind that you need to do that. So that means if you have three classes that day, that's 3 hours that you're in a class. And then you're going to be spending 2 hours for each one of those. So that's another 6 hours outside of the class. And I know a lot of people go, well, that's 9 hours that day. That's like longer than a work day. Yeah, it is. And in fact, it ends up for a 15-hour, if you have 15 hours of credits that semester, you're going to be spending about 45 hours a week in class or studying outside of class, or that should be kind of your considered minimum. So it's almost like a job. I remember one student that I had, and she was really upset because she said her dad told her, "This is your job. Going to school is your job." And she was like, that doesn't seem right. That doesn't seem fair because there's lots of other things I need to be doing. Like, I want to belong to clubs. I want to belong to a sorority. I want to belong to, some sort of other societies that are out there. I want to just have fun with my friends. And those are all important parts of going to college. I mean, that's part of the college experience and making and establishing relationships, being a part of, clubs and groups and those kind of social aspects are really important. But that's because it's a full life. It's a full-time, not only job, but spending your life. And so a lot of those kinds of things, like being in a club, is kind of like what you would do if you were to go to a job, but then you had some sort of hobby afterwards or doing other things after work time. It's the same thing here. There's a lot more flexibility in it. And as you know, and I know, some of those classes will not actually take that amount of time, but some of them will actually take a lot more. All right, now let's move on and talk a little bit about some specifics on studying for classes. I'm gonna briefly talk about something called a flipped class. And a flipped class is different than most of the classes you'll probably end up taking. Um, because most of the classes for most colleges are more of a lecture based, and then you do a lot of studying outside, like reading the textbook and things like that. But there's something called a flipped class. And a flipped class is where you do all the studying outside. You read the textbook, you do any assignments that are within the book or other assignments that are given to you outside of the classroom. And in the classroom, you're doing things like, you know, demonstrations, examples of something that came from the learning that you had outside the classroom. It may be role playing or practicing something like if you were, in the arts and you were doing a play, you'd be practicing the play and you would actually study the play and read up about it outside. And then when you got there, you would then be practicing the play, right? That's what's actually going on if you're in theater, for example. Well, flip classes are kind of like that, where what you're doing is you're doing all the work out, all the reading outside, all the studying, you're taking all the notes, annotated bibliographies, all of that is happening outside of class. And then inside of class is all demonstrations, examples, practicing aspects of whatever it is that you've learned, all of that in. So there's no actual study or lecture that happens during a flip class. But most of your classes are going to be a lecture class. So you're going to go in, you're going to listen to a professor talk. And there may be some discussion during that. And some lectures are pure lectures where you just sit there and write notes. In other cases, there will be lots of discussion back and forth, but a lot of the learning happens within the classroom setting. So let's talk about studying for those, since that's going to be most of what you're going to have in college for most people. Maybe if you're in theater or some performing arts or things like that, the classes are actually performing things, but most of the others are going to be learning important information in the classroom itself. Number one thing that you need to do, and I found that students don't do this much, and I think it's less and less, is making sure you read the material, whether it's the textbook or whether it's other journal articles or readings that they give you. Read it ahead of time. Too many students, what they do is they wait until after they've been to class to read. You might be able to get away with that, but I found that that's not the best way, and most people are not as successful that way. And the reason most people are not as successful that way is because when you get into the classroom and it's the first time you've heard the material and you're trying to take notes on that, you've got too much happening. There's too much going on at that point, and it's hard to decide what's important to write down and what's not. And if a classroom is moving really quickly, you're not going to be able to write everything down. You're going to need to be able to figure out what are the most important salient points. If you've read ahead of time, even if you don't fully understand the material, you kind of understand the flow. You get what's going on in it because most people, most of your professors will have like a PowerPoint slide or something like that that helps you go along and learn the material in order. And since that's going to follow usually the textbook or follow some sort of order that the professor has told you to read the material in, um, you will be able to follow along much more easily. So reading ahead of time is key because that way you know when you get to the classroom kind of the material. You may not understand it fully, but you'll have a good sense of what is supposed to be about and what's going on. Then when you get into the classroom, take your notes. Now, I always give the PowerPoint slides to you, and those are my outline. A lot of times students will say, well, are you going to give us a study guide or something like that? There are classes that works for, but a lot of them, the study is everything. We want you to know everything. And so otherwise we wouldn't have said, here's this chapter. Yes, I understand. There are some professors who will give you a textbook and you'll never look at the textbook. It happens, okay? That's just the way that it is. You're going to have to learn who does that and who doesn't, but as a general rule, most of the time the readings play an important role. So if you have the PowerPoint slides or you have some sort of, if you're not going to get slides, but you've gone through your reading and you've made sure that you've kind of taken brief notes of it. Used to be nowadays it's almost all ebooks. You can still highlight ebooks, but back in the day when you had an actual textbook in front of you, people would use a highlighter and highlight everything. And I usually suggest, by the way, don't do that. Because most people, when they've brought me their books to show me what they highlighted, the whole book was yellow. Well, if the book is yellow, you've highlighted everything, you're just going to go back and read everything again, right? And the idea behind highlighting it is picking out those important points. But you do need to, as you're reading, take brief notes, at least to outline these are the important topics that we're going through, and this is maybe an important term or something like that. That way, when you're taking the notes, if you don't have the PowerPoint slides in front of you, you will at least have the basic outline in front of you. So that means when you're taking notes, those things that you remember really well, you may not need to take a note on, or maybe just highlight it in your notes. And then the things that are new or things that are a different explanation for it, then you can take brief notes there and get good at taking brief notes. If you're writing down everything the professor says, you're not really listening and incorporating things. It's one of the reasons that the research indicates you're better off actually taking handwritten notes than you are by typing it. Remember, the more modalities that you can get involved, the better that it is. And while some people say they're a visual learner or an auditory learner, most people are not one or the other. In other words, it's everything together. You may prefer listening to it than reading it, but most people all of those things are best if you learn a lot of ways. So if you've read ahead of time, you've got the visual going on. If you've taken some notes along the way and just at least outlined the book a little bit, then you've also got the visual and the motoric. Then when you're in a classroom and you're listening to what is said, now you're processing it auditorily. And so you're getting what's being said there. And by handwriting it, you're determining those important aspects that need to be going into your notes, the things that fit with what you learned before. That way, you're actually thinking about it. You're processing. You're learning better that way rather than just typing everything as quickly as you can down. So it all goes together and will help you learn a lot better. Now, after that class is done, that day you need to go back and start studying, meaning putting it all together. Put together the notes, and if you've got the PowerPoints, put them together. I usually suggest, if you've got the PowerPoints, going ahead and writing notes next to the PowerPoints. But if you don't do that, you like to write it on a sheet of paper, marry those together later on. Put them together so you know that they're the order that they come in, and you'll start seeing the connections between what the book says, what's in the PowerPoints, which usually line up pretty directly, and then what the notes are, the examples that the professor gives, and those kind of things. Remember that the examples and the explanations and things like that that are given in class are to supplement all of the other learning. So that's only a part of it. It's to make it clearer for you. It's to answer questions for you in the classroom. Then when you, after the class is over with, you put all of those together. It's best to spend that day doing it. If you wait till the end of the week, you won't remember as much. You'll forget most of it. So the sooner that you can start putting it into long-term memory. Remember, short-term memory was allowing you to write it all down. Putting it into long-term memory requires you to go back and look at it again. If you're getting to the day or 2 days before the test and you are cramming, you haven't studied correctly because by that point, it should all be in there. So it's simply a review. It's reminding you again. So if you're staying up all night long, and believe me, I was an undergrad. I did that sometimes too, where I'm cramming at night before trying to get it all in. It's just not effective. You need to do it on a day-to-day basis. That way, when you get to your weekends and you want to be doing things within clubs or things with your friends or whatever that happens to be that's more social and more fun, you'll have more time to do that because you've spent more time every day after class making sure you're doing that. And you're going to have a couple of days that are not nearly as long, right? So you might have some days that are 9-hour days, 3 classes, 6 hours of studying for them. But you may have the next day where you have one class or maybe 2 classes, right? So you've got shorter days those days that allow you more flexibility to do that. And the nice thing about this studying for college as opposed to perhaps work is that you can structure that different ways. Once you get those 3 hours of class, then where do those 6 hours of studying happen? Do you take 2 hours for dinner that and then study a little bit later? That's okay too. As long as you try to get those in, make sure you get plenty of sleep because that'll make a lot of difference. Then when you get to the test will be pretty clear and straightforward for, and you'll understand it. When you're studying directly for the test, think about how the professor has presented things and how you could ask it. Sometimes you can ask, for example, a definition. You could give you the word and then you have to come up with the definition. In some cases, you're given the definition and you have to come up with the word. Learning it both ways makes a difference. I also recommend asking yourself questions from more of an applied position. What would this look like outside? Give you an example of this. So I'm a psychologist. I teach psychology. So we may have a situation where we're looking at depression. And so I could ask you which of the following are symptoms of major depression. And I could list some symptoms and ask you to choose which ones are those symptoms that go along with major depression. I could also give you a bunch of symptoms and say, what's the diagnosis? Do you know that all those symptoms that go together are major depression? I could also do that same kind of thing, but I could say something like, Johnny is a 30-year-old male and he shows the following symptoms. He's sad, has suicidal ideations. He feels like he would, doesn't want to get up in the morning. He has no energy. All of those kind of things can be possible things that are going along with a major depressive episode. And then I'll ask you, what's the diagnosis for that? So that's more of an applied because again, in psychology, people are going to come in and they're going to tell you symptoms that they have. They're not going to come in and tell you, I've got depression. They're going to come in and go, I'm sad, I'm blue, I have no energy, I can't eat. They're going to tell you all of those kinds of things. And then your responsibility is to try to figure out what's going on with them. So that's an applied question. So when you start thinking along those lines, it allows you to analyze cases more and it makes it easier when you're going to take the test because now you're focused on understanding the whole concept, not just defining what major depression is, not just knowing the symptoms, but knowing them within the context of what it might be. And so the more that you can do those kind of things and ask yourself questions from those different directions, the easier it will be when it comes time to do the test. Okay. So these are just some points that will be helpful for you when you're studying for your classes. And that's going to be true across the board. So make sure you read ahead of time. Make sure you know that you're going to spend at least 2 hours outside of class for every hour you're inside of class, studying and putting all of that together. Remember, the studying may be reading the textbook, it may be answering some questions that the professor gives to you, it may be doing a project, but those are all the things that you're going to be doing to extra learn, because remember, the learning in the classroom is only part of it, and it's only a small part of it. In fact, it's 1/3 of everything that you ought to be doing to learning. And when you keep that in mind, it will really help you when you go to class so that you can be prepared each class period and then be prepared to do well on each test. So good luck to you. I hope your studying goes well, and I will talk to you in a later video.